They chained a man to the ground like an animal. The iron shackle around his neck was staked into the hard-packed Arizona dirt, the kind of spike they use for livestock. His shirt was gone, torn to ribbons during his capture, revealing a canvas of old scars and fresh, weeping lash marks across his back and shoulders. He was Apache, that much the soldiers knew, but they didn't care to learn his name. To them, he was a savage, a ghost in the desert. From a second-story window of the command post, a young woman named Emma Caldwell watched him. Her world was supposed to be one of ivory lace and imported teacups, of polite society dinners, and a future sealed by an arranged marriage. But her gaze kept returning to the man in the holding pen. He hadn't moved in hours, not even when the sun beat down on him, not even when the guards mocked him. He just sat there, upright, his silence more powerful than any scream. And the girl who watched him from the window? She was the daughter of the man who gave the order. Her father, Colonel Horace Caldwell, ran this outpost with an iron fist and a bottle of whiskey. He saw the world in black and white, order and chaos, civilization and savagery. To him, the man in the pen was a problem to be solved, a wild thing to be broken. That evening, as they sat on the veranda for dinner, the clinking of silverware a fragile sound against the vast, humming silence of the desert, he made his feelings clear. "We should have just left him in the sun," the colonel grumbled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Let the vultures save us the trouble." Emma pushed the peas around on her plate, her stomach twisting into a knot. "Was he armed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A knife," her father grunted. 10 inches of bone and steel, that's all they need." "He was alone," she pressed, a small act of rebellion. Her father's eyes, chips of cold blue ice, fixed on her. "You don't know their kind, Emma. One is a scout. 10 more are hiding behind the rocks waiting." He took a long swallow of his whiskey. "Your fiancé, Randall Given, will be arriving next week. He expects a proper wife, not some frontier reformer with misplaced sympathies. You'd do well to remember that." The name Randall Given tasted like ash in her mouth. He was a man twice her age, a man whose wealth was built on land deals and railroad contracts, a man who smelled of waxed mustache and condescension. He looked at her not as a person, but as a beautiful, well-bred acquisition, another jewel in his collection. Her future felt like a cage, polished and gilded, but a cage nonetheless. Something inside her, something that had always longed for dust and thunder, instead of parlors and pianos, was beginning to rattle the bars. Later that night, long after the lamps were extinguished and the outpost was submerged in the deep velvet blackness of the desert, Emma couldn't sleep. The moon was a sliver of bone hanging in the sky. She slipped out of her bed, her bare feet silent on the cool wooden floors. She didn't put on her slippers. She pulled on her riding boots. In the kitchen, she found a tin cup and filled it with cool water from the pump, the squeak of the handle sounding like a scream in the quiet. She crept out the back door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The sentry posted near the stables was asleep, his chin slumped to his chest, his rifle resting against the wall. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and horse and something wilder. She moved through the shadows, a ghost in her own right, until she reached the holding pen. He was awake. In the pale moonlight, his eyes were like chips of obsidian. He wasn't surprised to see her. It was as if he had been waiting. "I brought water," she whispered, her voice trembling, as she held the cup between the rough wooden posts. He didn't move for a long moment. He just watched her, his gaze steady and unreadable. Then slowly he reached out. His fingers, calloused and warm, brushed against hers as he took the cup. The brief touch sent a jolt through her, a current of something she didn't understand. He drank, not greedily like a man dying of thirst, but with a deliberate, slow dignity that felt like a rebuke to his captors. He handed the cup back, his eyes never leaving hers. "I shouldn't be here," she said, the words feeling foolish and small. He said nothing. His silence was a wall, a fortress. "What's your name?" she asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. She felt a flush of embarrassment. "You don't have to tell me. I'm Emma." Another beat of silence passed between them, stretched thin and taut. Then his voice, low and raspy from disuse, cut through the night. "Kai." The name felt ancient, powerful. It curled in the air like smoke. She nodded once, her heart thudding against her ribs. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something in the dust near the post he was chained to. A small object, no bigger than her thumb. It was a bird, intricately carved from a piece of scrap wood. A raven, its wings outstretched. The style was familiar, achingly so. She'd seen it before. Her brother William, who had died 2 years ago, used to carve birds just like that. Before she could ask, a voice cut through the darkness, sharp and sudden. "Miss Caldwell!" She spun around, her pulse hammering in her throat. Corporal Mills, one of the younger guards, stood there, his rifle held loosely in his hand, a look of pure confusion on his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you ought not be down here." The colonel. Emma straightened her spine, pulling the tattered remnants of her composure around her like a shawl. "The prisoner was denied water all day," she said, her tone colder than she intended. "I was remedying an oversight." Mills shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't think the colonel would see it that way, ma'am." "No," she said, her eyes flashing as she brushed past him, "but I wasn't asking for his permission." She walked back to the house, her boots crunching on the gravel. The image of the carved raven burned into her mind. Back in her room, she stood at the window, watching the lone figure chained to the earth. He hadn't moved, but she knew he was watching her too. The world her father had built, a world of rules and uniforms and brutal certainty, was beginning to crack. And the tiny wooden bird was the chisel that had just made the first fissure. What did it mean? How could this stranger, this Apache prisoner, know the one private thing her brother had left behind? That's when a terrifying thought began to bloom in the back of her mind. The official story was that her brother, a lieutenant in her father's regiment, had simply wandered out into the wilderness one day and never came back. Despondent, they called it, a victim of the frontier's cruel melancholy. But William wasn't the melancholic type. He was steady, he was strong, and he had been vehemently opposed to Randall Gibbons' latest land acquisition, a stretch of territory that bordered Apache sacred grounds. He had argued with their father about it for weeks, then he had gone silent, just like Kai. The morning sun cast long, golden fingers across the parade ground, but inside the Caldwell house the air was thick with unspoken tension. Emma stood before her mirror, not seeing her own reflection, but seeing the ghost of her brother. She saw the way his jaw would set when he was angry, the way his eyes, so much like her own, would darken with conviction. A sharp knock on her door startled her. "Emma, are you decent?" It was her father. "Yes," she called out, pulling her robe tighter. Colonel Caldwell entered, his uniform already perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleaming like little gold medals. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Gibbon arrives tomorrow. He's arranged for a photographer to take an engagement portrait. He wants it sent back east for the society papers." The words felt like a slap. "I haven't agreed to marry him," she said, her voice tight. "You will," her father stated, not as a request, but as a fact. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion. "This is a good match, Emma. Randall is a man of influence. His partnership with the regiment is beneficial. The West is no place for a woman alone." "He's twice my age," she shot back, "and he looks at me like I'm a horse he's thinking of buying." "He will provide for you," the colonel said, his patience wearing thin. "That's more than most can hope for out here. Do not make this difficult." He turned to leave, but Emma's next words stopped him cold. "Did William know Kai?" The colonel froze, his back to her. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously low. "Your brother had dealings with many of the local scouts. It's irrelevant." "He carved birds," Emma pressed, her heart pounding. "Ravens, just like the one I found near the holding pen." Her father turned slowly, and the look on his face was one she had never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was something colder, something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "You will stay away from that prisoner," he hissed. "You will put on the lavender dress Gibbons sent for you, you will smile for the photographer, and you will forget these foolish fantasies. Is that understood?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. Emma knew then, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her father was lying. The story of her brother's death was a lie. And Kai, the man chained to the ground outside, was somehow at the center of it all. He wasn't just a random Apache scout. He was a witness. That night, she didn't just bring him water. She went to her father's study. The room smelled of leather and cigar smoke, the scent of her father's authority. She had never dared to go through his things before, but tonight, she was no longer his obedient daughter. The lock on his desk drawer was flimsy. A hairpin was all it took. Inside, beneath stacks of official reports and supply ledgers, she found it. A separate folder, bound in worn leather. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was filled with land deeds, acquisition logs, and survey maps, all related to the new railway line. Most of the plots were marked with the names of investors from back east, but a few, marked in red ink, were different. These were tribal lands, Apache lands. Beside the crude X marks of the tribal elders who had supposedly signed away their heritage, was another signature, neat and precise, Colonel Horace Caldwell, and co-signing as the primary investor, Randall Given. Her breath hitched. This was it. This was the deal William had been fighting against. But then she saw something that made the blood drain from her face. Tucked at the back of the folder was a smaller folded piece of paper. It was a military report, a scout's debriefing. It detailed a meeting between Randall Given and a few of the younger, more desperate Apache warriors. A meeting where money was exchanged for promises of influence. The report was written in her brother's hand, and the name of the scout who had guided him there, who had served as his translator and witness, was listed at the top. Kai. The last line of the report was chilling. Mr. Given has offered them weapons in exchange for a staged raid. He means to clear the valley by force and blame the Apache. This is not just theft, it is murder. I cannot be a part of it. The report was dated the day before her brother disappeared. She slammed the drawer shut, a wave of nausea washing over her. They hadn't just silenced her brother, they had murdered him, and Kai was the only other person who knew the truth. His capture wasn't about a stolen knife. It was about ensuring his permanent silence. A cold, hard fury settled in her heart, displacing the fear. They had taken her brother. They were trying to take her future. They would not take this man, too. She found the key to the holding pen on a hook in the stables, right where Corporal Mills kept the keys for the supply lockers. It felt too easy, almost like it had been left for her. She didn't question it. Grabbing a small bundle of bread and a full canteen, she slipped back into the darkness. When she reached the pen, Kai was already standing, watching the path from the house. He knew. "I saw your name," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion as she fumbled with the lock. "In a report, with my brother William." For the first time his expression changed. The mask of stoicism cracked, revealing a flicker of deep, profound sorrow. "He was a good man," Kai said, his voice rough. "He tried to stop them. They killed him for it, didn't they?" Kai simply nodded. The lock clicked open. The sound was like a cannon blast in the silent night. She pushed the heavy gate open. "They will kill you too." He stepped out of the pen, stretching his bruised and battered limbs. He looked at the main house, then back at her. "They will hunt you for this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Let them," Emma said, a fire she never knew she possessed now burning in her eyes. "I'm tired of living in their world anyway." They didn't run. Running would draw attention. They walked calmly and deliberately towards the rear of the outpost, melting into the shadows like they were born to them. Emma had planned ahead. A small supply wagon, meant for a morning run to the next town, was hitched and waiting. She had already stashed blankets and what little food she could gather in the back. As they reached the wagon, Kai stopped. He looked back at the outpost, at the life he was leaving chained in the dirt, and the life she was abandoning in the big house on the hill. Then he looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw not a prisoner, but a man. "This road," he said, his voice low and serious, "it does not lead back." "I know," she whispered, offering her hand to help him into the wagon. "Good." He took her hand, his grip strong and sure. As the wagon creaked forward, rolling silently on the dusty track leading away from Fort Grant, Emma didn't feel like she was running away from something. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was running towards it. But as the familiar silhouette of the outpost faded behind them, a new, chilling thought took hold. Gibbon wasn't a man who accepted defeat. He wouldn't just send soldiers after them. Soldiers followed rules. He would send men who didn't, men who were paid to make problems disappear. And they wouldn't be coming to bring her home. They'd be coming to bury the truth, right alongside her and Kai. The desert ahead was vast and unforgiving, but it was the hunters behind them that truly terrified her. The first 2 days were a blur of dust and sun. They traveled east, following an old forgotten trapper's trail that wound its way into the jagged teeth of the San Mateo Mountains. Kai, despite his injuries, was a different man outside the cage. The desert wasn't an enemy to him. It was a language he understood. He navigated by the angle of the sun, the shape of the rocks, the subtle shift in the wind. He was quiet, conserving his strength, but his eyes were constantly moving, reading the landscape, watching their back trail. Emma drove the wagon, her hands raw from the reins, her skin burning under the relentless sun. The stiff lace of her Boston dresses was a distant memory. Now she wore a simple riding blouse and trousers she'd stolen from her brother's old trunk. Clothes that felt more honest, more real than anything she'd ever owned. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of what they had done and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. On the third morning, the sky turned a hazy metallic gray and the air grew thick and still. The heat was oppressive. Kai, who had been sitting in the back of the wagon, suddenly went rigid. "Stop," he said, his voice a low command. Emma pulled the mules to a halt. "What is it?" "Riders," he said, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the distant ridge behind them. 3 of them, moving fast. Emma's blood ran cold. She squinted, but could only see shimmering heat waves. "Are you sure? It could be a patrol." "No," Kai said, his jaw tight. "Patrols ride in formation. These men ride like wolves. They're hunters." Gibbon's men, panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "What do we do? The wagon is too slow." "We leave it," he said without hesitation. "We go higher, where the horses can't follow easily." Abandoning the wagon felt like cutting off a limb. It held their food, their water, their blankets, everything that was keeping them alive. But looking at the grim certainty in Kai's face, she knew he was right. They quickly grabbed what they could carry: 2 canteens of water, a small bag of jerky, and the precious leather folder containing her brother's report. They scrambled up the rocky slope, the thorny scrub tearing at their clothes. The climbing was brutal. Emma's lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. Kai, despite a noticeable limp from the shackle, moved with a steady, desperate grace. When they reached a high ledge, they ducked behind a cluster of massive boulders and looked back. The riders were visible now, 3 dark figures on horseback sweeping across the canyon floor below. They weren't wearing cavalry blue. They wore dusty civilian clothes and they carried repeating rifles. One man in the lead wore a distinctive red sash around his waist. Emma's stomach dropped. She knew that sash. It belonged to a man named Sutter, a former Army scout her father had dishonorably discharged for brutality. A man who now worked as Randall Gibbon's personal enforcer. They weren't just being followed, they were being hunted by a killer. They pressed on, moving deeper into the labyrinth of rocks and cliffs. By late afternoon, their water was nearly gone. Emma's throat was a raw, sandpaper tunnel. Kai's face was pale beneath his sun-darkened skin, and a feverish glaze had settled in his eyes. The wounds on his wrists, torn raw by the iron cuffs, had become infected. He stumbled, catching himself against a rock wall, a pained grunt escaping his lips. "We have to stop," Emma said, rushing to his side. "You're burning up." He tried to protest, but the strength wasn't there. She eased him to the ground in the thin shade of an overhanging ledge. His skin was hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. She tore a strip of cloth from her blouse, dampened it with the last few precious drops of water from her canteen, and pressed it to his forehead. "Stay with me, Kai," she whispered, her own fear a rising tide in her chest. "This can't be how it ends." His eyes fluttered open. "William," he murmured, his voice slurred with fever. "He told me about the water, the Red Creek." "What about the water, Kai?" "Given," He's poisoning it, he rasped, upstream, where the herds graze, blaming the Apache, a reason to drive them out before the railroad comes. The sheer, calculated evil of it stole her breath. It wasn't just about stealing land. It was about genocide, slow and methodical, and her father was a part of it. The man who had taught her to read, who had bounced her on his knee, was complicit in a plan to poison women and children. The world tilted on its axis, the last vestiges of her old life crumbling into dust. She spent the rest of the afternoon tending to his wounds, cleaning them as best she could, and applying a salve she'd taken from the outpost. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, his fever began to break. He was weak but lucid. "They'll find us by morning," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "I know," she said, her own voice hollow. They sat in silence, the vast, lonely landscape stretching out around them. Far below, they could see the flicker of a small campfire. The hunters. They had made camp for the night, confident their prey was trapped. "There is a place," Kai said after a long while, his gaze on the distant mountains. "A hidden canyon. My people call it Willow's Hollow. It is sacred ground, a place of healing. If we can reach it." "How far?" "A day's hard journey, maybe more in our state." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the fading light. "You risked everything for me. You do not have to do more. You could go down there, tell them you were taken. Your father would protect you." Emma stared at the fire below, at the three men who represented the world she had left behind. A world of lies and greed and casual cruelty. Then she looked at Kai, at the man who had been chained and beaten for daring to hold on to the truth. "They wouldn't just be burying your story, Kai," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "They'd be burying my brothers too. And mine." She met his gaze, her decision hardening into something unbreakable. "We get to Willow's Hollow, together." A small, weary smile touched his lips. "Willows bend," he said softly, "but they do not break." Before they could plan their next move, a sound echoed up the canyon wall. Not a gunshot. A scream. Sharp, sudden, and choked with agony. It was followed by another, then the unmistakable crack of a rifle. But the sound was different. Heavier than the hunters' carbines. Emma and Kai exchanged a look of pure confusion. They crawled to the edge of the ledge and peered down into the growing darkness. The scene at the campfire below was one of chaos. Two of the hunters were down. The third, Sutter, the man with the red sash, was staggering back, clutching a bloody shoulder. Standing over the bodies, silhouetted against the firelight, was a new figure. A lone rider on a powerful black horse. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadow, and he held a large caliber buffalo gun, its barrel still smoking. He wasn't Apache. He wasn't a soldier. Who was he? Before they could process what was happening, the rider looked up, his gaze sweeping the cliffs. For a terrifying second, Emma felt his eyes locked directly onto their hiding place. He raised his rifle and Emma flinched, pulling Kai back behind the rock. But he didn't shoot. Instead, a voice deep and gravelly echoed up the canyon. "Caldwell's girl, I know you're up there. Given sends his regards. Says the price on the Apache's head just went up. But his offer for you still stands. Come down and he'll let you live. A different kind of cage, but you'll live." It was a trap. Given hadn't just sent Sutter. He had sent a backup plan. This man wasn't a hunter. He was an executioner. "We have to move," Kai hissed, grabbing her arm. "Now!" They scrambled away from the ledge, plunging deeper into the darkness of the high country. Behind them, they heard the lone rider laugh, a sound that was utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of a patient predator who knew, sooner or later, his prey would have to come down from the mountain. They had escaped one set of hunters, only to be cornered by something far more dangerous. The journey to Willow's Hollow was a fever dream. They moved by night, guided by the stars and Kai's deep, instinctual knowledge of the land. The lone rider, who they now called the Shadow, was a persistent threat. They would see his campfire flicker in the distance, always behind them, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, a constant menacing reminder that they were not free. He was toying with them, driving them deeper into the wilderness, wearing them down. Kai's strength returned in slow increments, but the ordeal had taken its toll. They were gaunt, haunted figures, surviving on the last of the jerky and a few bitter roots Kai managed to dig up. The hope of reaching the sanctuary of Willow's Hollow was the only thing that kept them moving. Finally, after a night spent navigating a treacherous, narrow canyon, Kai stopped. The air had changed. It was cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. "We're close," he breathed, a note of reverence in his voice. They followed a barely there trail, marked by stones piled in a way that looked natural to an untrained eye. The path opened into a hidden basin, a slash of impossible green, tucked between towering red rock walls. A small, clear stream trickled through a grove of ancient willow trees, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the pre-dawn light. This was it. Willow's Hollow. An old woman with a face like a beautiful, weathered map emerged from a low structure made of adobe and cedar. She didn't look surprised to see them. Her dark, knowing eyes took in their ragged appearance, lingering on Kai's bruised face and then on Emma. "You have come," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. She was the elder Kai had spoken of, a woman named Chosovi. Kai placed his palm against hers in a gesture of deep respect. "We were followed," he said in his own language. Chosovi nodded slowly. "The shadow on the mountain. We have seen him. He waits." She looked at Emma, her gaze piercing. "This one, she carries the storm with her." "She carries the truth," Kai corrected gently. "She is an ally." The elder's expression softened slightly. "Allies are welcome. The storm is not." They were given food, a warm, savory stew that felt like life itself pouring back into them, and clean water. Emma was shown to a small dwelling where she could wash the grime and fear of the past week from her skin. As she looked at her reflection in a bowl of water, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was sunburned and thin, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes held a new hardness, a new resolve. The girl who had looked out the window at Fort Grant was gone forever. That evening, they sat by a communal fire, the heart of the small, hidden community. The Apache people here lived simply, their lives woven into the rhythms of the canyon. They treated Kai with a quiet reverence, and Emma with a cautious curiosity. They were safe. For the first time in days, Emma felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to unwind. She showed Chosovi her brother's report. The old woman listened intently as Emma explained the poisoned water, the land grab, the murder of her brother. Chosovi nodded, her face grim. "We have feared this. The creek spirits have been crying for months. The deer grow sick." "This report is the only proof we have," Emma said. "Proof is a white man's word," Chosovi said, her voice laced with ancient sorrow. "They will say it is a forgery. They will say the son betrayed the father. They will not believe you." A cold dread trickled down Emma's spine. "Then what do we do?" "There is another proof," the elder said, her eyes distant. "Before your brother died, he knew he was in danger. He sought out our wise men. He gave one of them a package, wrapped in leather, sealed with his family's crest. He said it held the white man's truth. The original signed agreements from the railroad, the letters from Given detailing his plan. He said if anything happened to him, we were to use it to protect our people." Hope, fierce and bright, surged in Emma's chest. "Where is it? Where is this package?" Chosovi's face clouded with regret. "The man he gave it to, a young warrior named Tassa, he was ambitious. He saw the papers not as a shield, but as a sword. He argued with the council, said they should use the documents to bargain with the railroad to get a better price for our silence." "And where is he now?" Kai asked, his voice sharp. "He left the hollow 2 weeks ago," Chosovi said, her voice heavy with shame. "He said he was going to the railhead at Dusty Fork to meet with Given's men, to make his own deal." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Tassa had betrayed them. He had the real proof, and he was trying to sell it. The man in the black coat, the shadow on the mountain, he wasn't hunting them. He was waiting for Tassa. The attack on Sutter's camp wasn't a rescue. It was one snake eating another. "Given knows," Emma whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He knows the proof exists, and he sent his man to get it back and eliminate the seller. He doesn't know we know about it. The shadow is not just waiting for Taza, Kai said, his eyes locking with Emma's, a dawning horror on his face. He's watching this canyon. He's waiting to see who Taza might have been working with. He's here to wipe out anyone who even knows the papers exist. The safety of Willow's Hollow was an illusion. They hadn't led the danger away from these people. They had led it right to their doorstep. Suddenly, a cry went up from the watchpost at the canyon's entrance. A young boy ran into the firelight, his eyes wide with terror. "He is coming! The man on the black horse! He is coming down the trail!" The shadow was done waiting. Panic erupted. The peaceful sanctuary turned into a scene of frantic preparation. The few warriors present grabbed bows and old rifles, their faces grim. Chosovi turned to Emma and Kai, her voice urgent. "You must go. Taza's betrayal has brought a curse upon us. The shadow comes for the papers, but he will not leave any witnesses. You brought this storm here, you must lead it away." "We won't abandon you," Emma protested. "It is not abandonment," the old woman said, pressing a small, heavy pouch into Emma's hand. It was filled with dried meat and corn. "It is the only way. He hunts you. If you are gone, he may pass us by. Go north through the high pass. It will take you back towards the settlements. He will follow." Kai was already moving, grabbing the folder with William's report. "She's right. Our fight is not here." There was no time for goodbyes. They slipped out the back of the canyon, climbing a steep, hidden path as the first gunshots echoed from the valley floor below. Each shot was a fresh stab of guilt in Emma's heart. They were running again, leaving people to fight a battle that belonged to them. As they reached the top of the ridge, they looked back. They could see the lone rider, a figure of absolute menace, firing systematically into the adobe dwellings. He wasn't trying to fight. He was trying to slaughter. "He knows the papers aren't there," Emma realized, horror dawning on her. "He thinks we have them. He's not just eliminating witnesses. He's sending a message. This is what happens to people who help us." They ran, fueled by a mixture of grief and white-hot rage. They had to get the real proof. They had to stop this. But as they crested the ridge and started down the other side, a figure rose from behind a rock in front of them, blocking their path. It was Taza. His face was bruised and his arm was in a makeshift sling. He held a pistol in his good hand, and his eyes were wild with desperation and fear. "The papers," he rasped, gesturing at the folder in Kai's hand. "Give them to me. It's my only bargaining chip." "It's over, Taza," Kai said, his voice low and dangerous. "You betrayed our people. You brought the shadow down on them." "He double-crossed me," Taza spat. "He took the real documents and left me for dead. This report," he nodded at the folder, "it's all I have left. Give it to me." He raised the pistol, his hand shaking. But before he could fire, a gunshot, loud and final, cracked through the air. Taza jerked, a red flower blooming on his chest. He collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide with surprise. Behind him, not 20 yards away, stood the shadow. He lowered his buffalo gun, a cruel smirk visible on his face for the first time. "Thanks for flushing him out for me," the shadow called out, his voice laced with mocking amusement. He began to reload the massive rifle with a slow, deliberate motion. "Now, about those other papers, the ones Taza seemed to think were so important. Given wants them, and he wants the girl. He didn't say anything about wanting the Apache alive." They were trapped. The cliff was behind them, and the killer was in front of them. There was nowhere left to run. The shadow raised his rifle, the huge barrel looking like a dark tunnel into oblivion. Emma instinctively stepped in front of Kai, a useless, desperate gesture. This was it, the end of the road. But as the man's finger tightened on the trigger, another figure appeared on the ridge to his left. It was Corporal Mills. He held his standard-issue cavalry rifle, and it was aimed squarely at the shadow's back. "Drop it!" Mills yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and determination. The shadow froze, surprise flickering across his face. He slowly turned his head. "A soldier boy? You're a long way from home." "I took an oath," Mills said, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle, "to protect the innocent. Lieutenant Caldwell, William, he was my friend. He told me what Given was planning. I didn't believe him. Not until the colonel confined me to the fort the day after he disappeared. I knew then. I've been tracking you for days. You and what army? The shadow sneered. Just me, Mills said. But his distraction was all they needed. Now! Kai yelled. He grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her sideways, scrambling behind a tall spire of rock just as the shadow, ignoring Mills, whirled and fired. The massive slug slammed into the rock where they had been standing, spraying stone chips like shrapnel. Mills fired back, his shot going wide. Go! Mills screamed at them. Get to the railhead at Dusty Fork. The telegraph. It's the only way to get the word out. I'll hold him off. We can't leave you, Emma cried. That's an order, ma'am, he yelled back, chambering another round. From a friend of your brother's. Now go. They didn't wait to argue. They ran, scrambling down the treacherous slope, the sounds of the gunfight echoing behind them. They didn't know if Mills would survive. They only knew that his sacrifice had bought them a chance, a final, desperate chance to expose the truth. But as they ran, Emma's mind was racing. The shadow had the real documents, the ones William had died to protect. Taza was dead. Mills was probably dying. The people of Willow's Hollow were being slaughtered. All they had was William's uncorroborated report. Chosovi was right. It wasn't enough. No one would believe the word of a runaway girl and an Apache fugitive against a man as powerful as Randall Gibbon. They were running towards a telegraph station to send a message that no one would believe, armed with proof that no longer mattered, while everyone who could have helped them was being erased from the earth. It was hopeless. Unless... Emma stopped so abruptly that Kai stumbled into her. She stared back in the direction of the fort, a wild, impossible idea taking shape in her mind. What is it? Kai asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The proof, she said, her eyes wide with a terrifying new purpose. The shadow has the documents William gave to Tassa, but that wasn't all of it. What are you talking about? William was meticulous, she said, her mind flashing back to her brother's study, to the way he organized his maps and reports. He always made copies, always. He had a secret hiding place, a loose floorboard under his desk. We used it to hide things from Father when we were children. Her gaze met Kai's, her heart pounding with the sheer audacity of her plan. The real proof isn't with the shadow. He only has the copies William gave to Tassa. The originals, the signed, sealed originals, are still at the fort. Kai stared at her, the implication of her words sinking in. Going to the railhead was a desperate gamble. Going back to Fort Grant? That was suicide. We have to go back, Emma said, her voice trembling but firm. It's the only way. They were no longer the hunted. They had to become the hunters. They had to walk back into the lion's den. The journey back was a descent into a special kind of hell. They were no longer running from danger, but towards it. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a horseman. They moved in a wide, looping circle, avoiding the main trails, living off the land, and the last of the food Chosovi had given them. The guilt over what happened at Willow's Hollow and to Corporal Mills was a physical weight, pressing down on them, fueling their grim determination. During the long nights huddled together for warmth against the biting desert cold, they talked. Emma told him about her brother, about their childhood, about the cage of expectations she had lived in. Kai spoke of his family, of the stories and traditions that were being systematically erased by men like her father and Gibbon. They were two people from different worlds, stripped bare by circumstance, finding a fragile, unspoken connection in their shared loss and their shared purpose. The silence between them was now filled with a deep, profound understanding. They scouted the fort for a full day from a high ridge, watching the comings and goings of the soldiers. Security was tighter than before. Sentries were doubled. Her father, Emma realized, was scared. He knew she had escaped with Kai, and he knew what they were capable of exposing. We can't go in the front, Kai stated the obvious. There's a weak point, Emma said, pointing. A drainage culvert on the south wall. It runs right under the parade ground and comes up near the back of the stables. We used to dare each other to crawl through it as kids. It's narrow, but we can fit. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, they made their move. They slipped through the darkness. their movements synchronized, their senses on high alert. The culvert was as dark and suffocating as a tomb. It smelled of stagnant water and earth. Emma fought back a wave of claustrophobia, focusing on her brother's face, on the memory of his smile. They emerged covered in grime into the familiar shadows of the stables. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horse. The main house was dark, except for a single lamp burning in her father's study. He was awake, waiting. They crept across the parade ground, sticking to the shadows, their hearts pounding in unison. Reaching the back of the house, Emma led Kai to a small service entrance used by the kitchen staff. The lock was old and easily picked. They were inside. The house was eerily silent, a place of ghosts and memories. Every creaking floorboard sounded like a thunderclap. They moved up the back staircase to the second floor. Her father's study was at the end of the hall. The light was still on under the door. Emma put her ear to the wood. She could hear two voices, her father's and another, smoother, more sinister voice that made her blood run cold. Randall Given. "A complete disaster, Horace," Given was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your daughter has made a mockery of us. And that scout of yours, Sutter, managed to lose the primary documents and get himself killed by some backwoods corporal. Pathetic." "The situation is contained," Colonel Caldwell replied, his voice weary, defeated. "Contained? Your daughter is still out there with that savage, with a copy of your son's ridiculous report. It's only a matter of time before she gets it to someone who will listen. This has to end. Tonight." "What are you suggesting?" "I've posted men on all the roads, and I have men inside this fort who are loyal to my payroll, not to your command. If she's foolish enough to show her face, she will be dealt with, quietly, and her Apache friend will hang for her murder. A tragic but tidy end to the story." Emma pulled back from the door, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a gasp. It was worse than she thought. Given had infiltrated the fort itself. They hadn't just walked into a lion's den. They had walked into a trap that had been set just for them. Kai pulled her back into the shadows of the hallway. "We have to go, now." "No," Emma whispered, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "Not without it." They slipped into her brother's old room, which had been left untouched, a perfect dusty shrine to a dead son. Emma knelt on the floor, her fingers finding the familiar notch in the floorboard beneath his desk. She pried it open. There it was, a leather-wrapped package sealed with the Caldwell family crest. She broke the seal, her hands trembling. Inside were not just copies. They were the original, signed contracts between the railroad and the War Department, with Randall Given's signature on everyone. There were letters written in Given's own hand, detailing the plan to poison the Red Creek and frame the Apache. And at the very bottom, there was one last letter, written by her brother to the Secretary of War, a letter he never got the chance to send. It laid out the entire conspiracy, naming his own father as a reluctant but complicit partner. This was it, the irrefutable truth. As she stood up clutching the papers, the door to the room creaked open. A soldier stood there, not one of the familiar faces, but a hard-eyed stranger, one of Given's men. His eyes widened when he saw them, and he reached for the pistol at his hip. Kai moved faster than she thought possible. He launched himself across the room, slamming the soldier against the wall before he could draw his weapon. The man grunted, and they fell to the floor in a desperate, silent struggle. Kai was weakened by his ordeal, and the soldier was fresh and strong. The soldier's hand closed around his pistol. Emma didn't think. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a brass candlestick from the mantelpiece, and brought it down hard on the back of the man's head. He went limp, slumping to the floor. Footsteps were pounding down the hallway. The struggle had been heard. "Out the window!" Kai gasped, pulling her towards the front of the room. They scrambled onto the narrow veranda that overlooked the main parade ground. Doors were being thrown open behind them. Shouts echoed through the house. "There they are!" A gunshot shattered the window next to Emma's head. They were trapped, 2 stories up, with nowhere to go. Below, the parade ground was beginning to fill with soldiers, some loyal to her father, others loyal to Given, all of them confused and on edge. Then the door to her father's study was thrown open. Colonel Caldwell stood there, his face ashen in the lamplight. Behind him, Randall Gibbon stood with a pistol in his hand, a triumphant smirk on his face. "It's over, Emma," Gibbon called out, his voice ringing with victory. "Give me the papers. Your father has already agreed. We'll tell them the Apache kidnapped you, forced you to help him. You'll be sent back east to recover from your ordeal. It's the only way to save your family's name." Emma looked at her father, who stood there, a broken man, unable to meet her eyes. She looked at the damning papers in her hand, and she looked at Kai, who stood beside her, ready to fight to the death. She had one last desperate card to play. "You want the papers, Mr. Gibbon?" she shouted, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the entire parade ground. "You want the proof of your crimes? Here it is." And with a powerful heave, she threw the entire stack of documents into the air. The papers, the letters, the contracts, the deeds, scattered like a flock of white birds, fluttering down into the lamplit chaos of the parade ground below. Soldiers, officers, and Gibbon's hired guns all looked up, momentarily stunned, as the evidence of the conspiracy literally rained down upon them. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then all hell broke loose. Gibbon screamed in rage, raising his pistol towards Emma. "You foolish girl!" But before he could fire, Colonel Caldwell moved. In that final moment, he made a choice. He wasn't a colonel. He wasn't a conspirator. He was a father. He lunged at Gibbon, not to attack him, but to shove him aside to spoil his aim. The gun went off. The shot was deafening in the enclosed hallway. Colonel Caldwell staggered back, a dark stain spreading across the front of his pristine uniform. He looked at Emma, his eyes filled with a universe of regret, and then he collapsed. The single gunshot acted as a trigger. On the parade ground, confusion turned to open conflict. The soldiers loyal to the colonel, seeing him fall, turned on Gibbon's known men. Fists flew, rifles were raised. The fort erupted into a full-blown mutiny. In the chaos, Kai grabbed Emma's arm. "We have to go. Now is our only chance." He pulled her along the narrow veranda, towards the trellis thick with climbing roses that ran up the side of the house. It was a treacherous, desperate escape route, but it was the only one they had. As they scrambled down, splinters digging into their hands, Emma didn't look back. She couldn't. They reached the ground and sprinted for the stables. Horses screamed, panicked by the shouting and gunfire. Kai, with the calm certainty of a man who knew animals, soothed two mounts, throwing blankets on their backs. They swung up bareback, just as a group of Gibbon's men rounded the corner. They galloped out of the stables and straight through the heart of the brawling chaos on the parade ground. Men scattered before their charging horses. Emma caught a final glimpse of the scene, her father lying motionless on the veranda, Randall Gibbon being overwhelmed by a flood of furious, loyal soldiers, and the white papers, the truth, being trampled into the dust, but not before they had been seen. They spurred their horses toward the main gate, which now stood wide open and unguarded. They burst through it and into the vast, liberating darkness of the desert, the sounds of the riot at Fort Grant fading behind them. They rode until the horses were lathered and spent, until the sun began to bleed over the eastern horizon. They had escaped. They had exposed the truth, but the cost had been immense. Emma had lost her father, her home, her entire world. All she had left was the man riding beside her, in a future as uncertain as the shifting desert sands. They were free, but they were also ghosts, haunted by the fires they had started. As the new day dawned, Emma looked at Kai, his face set and grim in the pale light, and she knew their story wasn't over. They hadn't just written the final chapter. They had just begun a new book. The fallout was a distant storm they only heard echoes of. Weeks later, trading for supplies in a small town on the New Mexico line, they saw a newspaper, the St. Louis Dispatch. The headline was stark. "Army Conspiracy Exposed. Colonel Killed. Prominent Railroad Magnate Arrested in Apache Land Fraud Scandal." The story, pieced together from the scattered documents and the testimony of soldiers, told a sanitized version of the truth. It painted Colonel Caldwell as a conflicted hero who had died trying to stop the corruption. Randall Gibbon was the sole villain, now awaiting trial. The investigation was ongoing. There was a brief mention of the colonel's Missing, presumed deceased daughter. They were ghosts, and it was better that way. They traveled south seeking not just safety, but anonymity. They found it in a small, forgotten valley nestled deep in the Mimbres Mountains, a place of cottonwood trees and rich, dark soil. With their own hands, they built a life. They cleared a small patch of land, built a cabin from stone and cedar, and planted a garden. Kai taught Emma the ways of the land, how to read the seasons, how to find water, how to listen to the whispers of the wind. Emma taught him to read and write English, sharing the stories from the books she had loved as a girl. They didn't speak often of the fire and blood they had left behind, but it was always there, an unspoken foundation upon which they built their new world. It was a quiet life, a simple life, but it was real. It was theirs. One spring morning, nearly a year after their escape, Emma stood looking out at the valley, now green with new life. She placed a hand on her belly, where she felt the first, faint, fluttering promise of another new life beginning. She didn't say anything to Kai until that evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn a fiery orange. She took his hand and placed it where hers had been. He looked at her, his eyes questioning, and then a slow, profound understanding dawned on his face. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her, resting his forehead against hers, a gesture of such complete tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. "We will teach them," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We will teach them truth and how to walk between two worlds." Their daughter was born in the deep cold of winter, on a night when the wind howled like a hungry wolf outside their small cabin. They named her Lena, which meant sun ray in one of Kai's ancestral dialects. She was a child of two worlds, with her mother's determined blue eyes and her father's raven black hair. She grew up with her feet in the dirt and her head in the stars, as fluent in Apache stories as she was in English nursery rhymes. Years passed, flowing by like the seasons. Their life was not one of great events, but of small, precious moments. The first time Lena tracked a deer with her father, the pride on her face when she read her first full page from one of her mother's books, the sound of their laughter echoing in the quiet valley. One day when Lena was 10, she found the old worn leather satchel tucked away in a chest. Inside was the single faded newspaper clipping. She read it, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is this you?" she asked, pointing to the line about the colonel's missing daughter. Emma sat down beside her, the ghosts of the past stirring. "It was," she said softly, "a long time ago." "Were you afraid?" Lena asked, her eyes wide with the enormity of the story she was only just beginning to understand. Emma looked out at the peaceful valley, then at Kai, who was carving a small wooden bird, a raven, for their daughter. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said, "I was terrified, but I learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to light the fire anyway." Lena looked from her mother to her father, at the quiet, unshakable strength that bound them together. She looked at the home they had built with their bare hands, a sanctuary forged from truth and love. And in her parents' eyes, she saw the twin flames of the fire they had chosen, a fire that hadn't destroyed them, but had burned away everything that wasn't real, leaving only what truly mattered. Thank you so much for staying with us for this incredible journey. Stories like this, about courage and fighting for what's right, are the reason I started this channel. If Emma and Kai's story touched your heart, do me a huge favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We have so many more stories to share, and I wouldn't want you to miss a single one. We'll see you in the next video.